Well, good morning, and thank you everyone so much for coming. It is such an honor to speak with you today. One of the most frightening meetings of my life happened in 2012 in Bogota, Colombia. I was a first-year MBA student with this nebulous idea of founding some kind of global venture capital fund. And I had found this guy that I was meeting with through the alumni database. I knew he was some kind of former government leader and current business private equity leader. And in retrospect, I should have looked into him more before I reached out and set the meeting. He turned out to be about 3 times more important than I had thought and exactly as serious as I had feared. And we sat down in his office and he switched to Spanish and said, "¿Qué haces aquí? ¿Por qué Colombia? What are you doing here? Why Colombia?" So I said to myself, all right, Erik, everything has been up until this moment in terms of your professional life and also trying to learn Spanish. And I took a deep breath and I said, throughout university, I had the unbelievable good luck, dumb luck, of working alongside and learning directly from a man named Nassim Taleb. And ever since then, my professional life has been about trying to work his philosophies into the actual structure of the global economy in a more practical way. Those philosophies are predicated on 2 general concepts. The first being that the course of history is often driven by rare, high-impact events that fundamentally change the dynamics of countries, economies, and just about everything else, what are now popularized as black swan events. The other concept, which he deems anti-fragility, is the idea of building systems and lives and companies that not only can endure volatility and these black swan events, but can actually come off stronger on the other end. Just as a muscle gets stronger, the more stress you put it under, how to build a system that is more than robust, it actually comes out on the other side of crises better than ever. So the first part of my career was all about black swan events on the bad side of the equation, what we typically think of when we use that term. So my job was helping the global financial community deal with these crises, so the subprime crisis, of course, and unfortunately many others. And so I saw all of this up close, and I realized the need for bottom-up changing of the dynamics of the global financial system and the global economy in order to make it more anti-fragile and less subject to these kind of shocks. During that time, however, living in New York, I met brilliant entrepreneurs from all over the world, and none of them were actually from New York. I'm not convinced anyone's actually born in New York, but we were all from somewhere. I know one woman who says she was born in New York, and I believe her that she thinks she was, but I'm not sure that it's true. And that really got me thinking that I was meeting the fortunate people who got to come to the United States, to New York City, to build their dreams, and that there were so many like them from the countries that they originally came from who had the same abilities, but obviously for one reason or another just were unable to come or didn't want to come, and that shouldn't be a barrier the way that it currently is to building a global company and doing business with the world's largest economies and raising capital here and everything. So I finally started putting those 2 together and said, this is how we're going to make that kind of anti-fragile global economy. Is I want to build a venture fund and eventually help other funds to do the same and other founders to do the same that are predicated on global talent and global markets, and basically harnessing the collective power of mankind's ingenuity without geography and time zone serving as the barrier that they used to be. But to answer your original question that he had asked me, why are you here in Colombia? I'm here because, for one thing, if I'm going to be dedicating my life to the cause of global talent, I thought I should probably spend some time abroad and actually see that global talent in action as well and have a non-US base as well. And throughout my travels throughout Latin America, I was so unbelievably moved by the transition that I had witnessed or was witnessing in Colombia from a failed state whose drug cartels literally were the #1 focus of the US intelligence apparatus for many years, to a rising global power in terms of global technology, their global tech ecosystem. So I'm here because I want to help bring that forward, and if we can do that here, if we can do that in a country that has that kind of history, then the message across the world is going to be so powerful to all the people, all the countries that are looking to change their destiny and not let their past define their future and use global talent and technology to build a far better world together. And that's the true definition of anti-fragility for me. So as I was speaking, I finally saw this guy begin to smile a little and finally start holding back a little bit of emotion and everything. And after I finished, he just sat there in silence and then said, "I didn't catch any of that. Your Spanish is really terrible." So we switched to English, and the rest is history. So that was the beginning of the journey that I'm telling you about today, and I hope to express myself with the same clarity and dignity that I did that day as well. So over the next years, splitting my time between the United States and Latin America, I embarked with my fund on what was essentially one giant field experiment to answer the thesis, or to test the hypothesis: can a technology company focusing on the North American and European markets, in other words, the developed markets, for lack of a better term, where you can grow the quickest often, can they compete with and grow as quickly as companies that are entirely based in the United States? That experiment entailed being the director of a global accelerator for 3 years that 60 companies from around the world participated in, investing in 50 companies from Canada to Argentina and a few elsewhere through my fund and through other vehicles as well, working with various stakeholders, government, university, municipal, everything. And one of the big things I learned first, and this won't surprise you, but I would still be remiss if I didn't say it, is it is often the people who are new or are just finally encountering true opportunity who take advantage of it the most. We had, for example, a foundation that taught young children to code in key parts of Latin America. And there was this one kid, he was a kid when he started with us, who he was attending the classes to learn to code. We would give them metro fare to get home at the end. It was the equivalent of probably 50 cents at the time. And we later found out that he was walking home an hour and a half through the most dangerous parts of Medellin to hold on to that money, because that was going to be his seed capital for his first startup. So he rose through the ranks of our different talent development programs, eventually had a startup that we were able to invest in, became one of my field generals, so to speak, and speaking to the local youth population, saying, look, we have all been told all our lives that the way to get rich, especially if you want to do it quickly, is basically use your bodies, be an athlete, become a beauty queen, or unfortunately various illicit opportunities as well. And I'm here to tell you that one way to truly do it is use your mind instead. Learn to code, learn to be an entrepreneur, do business globally like I am. And you could just see, I mean, in half an hour, these kids, worlds being burned to the ground and rebuilt as they watched him speak about this. And then one day I received an invitation for speaking at a global conference in Colombia, Global Investor Conference, and they said, you can pick 3 companies that you're working with to come pitch us as well. So I went to him and I said, do you want one of the spots? And he said, yes. And I said, great. Oh, one more thing. It's in English, so you have to learn English for it. You have 6 months. And he said, OK. And he did. And he learned English in 6 months, enough to pitch them. And he actually splits his time now between San Francisco and Colombia, and still a good friend. And that's just one example of so many that I could tell you of what happens when you give people just a little bit of that opportunity, the power with which they will take advantage of it and become some of the most proactive, hardworking members of your team or founders in your portfolio that you have ever met. I also found that the same concept applied on the national level. And this is something I think we do occasionally get a bit wrong in our thinking. It is often because of, not in spite of, difficult history that companies and countries can find the momentum for innovation and hard work and basically harnessing that difficult force of history for forward motion. So often when we see countries whose names might scare us a little, like Colombia, we sometimes are a little less, we're a little less ready to hire there simply because we have things that we associate historically with the country that they're from. That is the wrong way to think about it. I was in a meeting once with a politician from Medellin, and this was a closed-door meeting, so he had no need to make grand speeches or anything, but he said, someday we're going to make this the greatest city in the world because we know how it felt to be the worst. And I thought there was something very beautiful in that. He was saying it's because we were so bad that we are now going to use that to become one of the leading cities on earth for innovation and global entrepreneurship. So I would say there should be no concern about that so long as you do proper vetting. Speaking of which, Vetting, yes, is very important when building global teams. It's something we weren't naive about when we started, but something we certainly learned also through trial and error a bit. And with my fund, what we found was when building global teams, to start at the senior level, to start at the high level, senior engineers, data scientists, designers, and then empower those people to build the team out beneath them in terms of the juniors and the other people that they need. And that made it much more scalable because you weren't thinking about hiring every single person as the founder or as the fund manager here in the United States. You were just thinking about finding the key people who can then also serve as basically as your team members who then build that up from there. So I finished this experiment very convinced that the first great wave of venture capital and startups was predicated on using the internet to power and sell products worldwide. And that the next great wave has to come from using the internet to build those products using teams worldwide. And I noticed that every time that I would speak to leading founders here in California, in New York, in any of the leading tech hubs in the developed world and said, what's your biggest problem? What can we most help you with? The answer was always the same. It was recruiting and retaining top talent. Now, don't mishear me. I'm not saying there isn't talent here. I'm just saying the competition for it is so fierce that as a young company, especially competing with the giants, you are often fighting a very difficult war in terms of building and maintaining that team. And the cost of turnover, for example, has been estimated at twice the annual salary when you take everything into account when you lose somebody at the early stage at the high level. And even before the Great Resignation, technology had the highest turnover rate of any sector in the United States. After finishing my fund, I thought about retiring for a few minutes, then I got bored, and then I decided to join an organization that I had occasionally brushed shoulders with throughout that journey. And this organization was Toptal, and they seemed to be the one company I was encountering that truly shared this philosophy of completely removing national borders as a barrier to who can work with whom and how. So I joined them first actually as a member of the Talent Network to continue working with global startups and the investors that were facilitating them. Then I also became their chief economist. And the key thing I learned through watching them at work as the world's largest entirely remote organization, I know this is going to be controversial, so absolutely let's debate it if you wish, but the fundamental thing I learned from them is the tools and techniques exist today to replicate the very best of what we mentally associate with all of us being in the same room together at the whiteboard, innovating together. We can do that now using the cloud. Now, I know that's going to be controversial, but I have seen it in action with them. How to directly do that, of course, is beyond the scope of one talk. I would refer you to a document that they wrote once the pandemic started and we all had to go remote by force, which is called the Suddenly Remote Playbook, where they just give you a complete takedown from culture to cybersecurity, everything in terms of running a global remote team. It's free and there's no email gate or anything, so it's a completely available resource too. When I asked my colleague Stephanie Courier, who runs their teams division, which builds entire teams to take ownership of building products, what are the top 3 things that you want me that I should say in terms of achieving that level of discipline and innovation together as a global remote team? She said the top 3 things are definitely communication. So just talk about that basically 3 times. So that probably won't surprise you. This will also probably be controversial, but it has not been my experience that communication is harder fundamentally with a global remote team. What it does do, though, is because you don't have the crutch of being in the same room together, you do realize the need for communication much more. So it's rather a more visible, elevated matter that everyone is constantly aware of, and that actually can be very useful. And that can make communication much more horizontal. Our CEO is a Slack message away like everyone else instead of in a corner office somewhere. And that brings up a point that has always fascinated me, which is how much constraints can actually be a huge driver of freedom and innovation. If you think of some of the most viral tech products of all time, many of them were built on a constraint that the product imposed upon you, a character limit, photos disappearing after a certain amount of time. Key deliberate constraints that then serve as the anchor for great innovation. So I would encourage all the founders in the room to keep that in mind as well. That often is a very fascinating common variable among the products that truly take off, is a chosen constraint. And all the great artists, inventors in history have used this. So the constraint of not being in the same room actually opens up opportunities and practices for bringing communication and coordination to a higher level using the very technologies that we're building that were previously, of course, unavailable to us. That being said, if you say, yeah, but I love that whiteboard session with everyone in person, and I love meeting in person, I would say, great, do it. I am concerned, and I think this is a very important point, that the very event that brought remote work to the forefront, the pandemic, may have clouded our perceptions, or many people's perceptions, on what we actually mean when we say it. 2020 and 2021 were quarantining during a global pandemic. That was not what we mean when we say remote work. Remote work does not mean, it is not meant in the negative sense of never leave your house, never meet in person. It's meant in the positive sense of remove geography and time zones as the constraints on who you can work with, how you can work, when and how and where you can best work. Because pretty much every study has found when they ask people working in a traditional office, how many hours of actual work do you do per day? Just between us. Usually it's about 3 hours out of the 8-hour workday. The rest of the time you're basically showing like you're working because you have to. You're all sitting there together. And that time can be so much better used in other things, including those magical moments when you're not technically at your desk working, but that opens your mind to come up with new ideas and everything. So again, remote work and global teams don't exist in any tension with traditional ways of working. It serves as an additional tool that allows you to go faster and farther than you otherwise would have been able to do. So I've also witnessed through Toptal and just through these global teams in action, the benefits of this go way beyond economics. And to be clear, neither my fund nor Toptal were in the business of just bringing the budget down on the team. We're not in the business of cheap labor. We're in the business of maximizing the impact of that budget. For example, it is precisely, every study they've ever done on this has found, it is precisely when you're doing breakthrough innovations or dealing with crises, and in other words, pretty much every day these days, and also pretty much everything involving startup and VC life, it is precisely at those moments that diversity of thought, having a diverse team truly pays off. And that, of course, makes sense. You're getting different points of view on a problem. Many great products come from the intersection of different disciplines and industries. So it is precisely then that having a global remote team can be truly powerful. Likewise, if you're building a global product with global customers, you're going to want a 24-hour development and upkeep cycle and a 24-hour security protocol. The vast majority of cyber attacks, which are increasingly the existential threat facing many technology companies, the vast majority happen outside of normal working hours and weekends, which makes sense. It's when I would do it if I was a hacker. So you want a global 24-hour team that is capable of responding to that. The hackers are a globally distributed team unbound by traditional ways of working, and only the same will truly be able to counter them. So these are the kinds of benefits that get unlocked when you remove geography and space as a constraint on how you can work and with whom. I don't think any of this is optional anymore. I think it's not the future, it's already here. It's just that as with many elements of the future, it's unevenly distributed, as they say. I don't think this is optional for founders, for fund managers, or for us collectively as mankind to take this approach now. I always love to do the thought experiment of if I described a magical resource to you and we all agreed it's the #1 driver of value for your company, and it's also often the biggest budget line item in your, for your financials, it's distributed equally around the world, but you have the option of sourcing it around the world versus in your immediate vicinity. Would you rather go local or global? You would say, of course, I would do it globally. For some reason, when I mentioned that magical resource is called talent, the mentality tends to shift, and many companies say, I think I'd maybe rather stay with my local community. I'm not one for sports metaphors very often, but if I was building my team, sourcing the best people around the world, and you concentrate your team in one particular city, then I think I know what will happen when our teams finally face off against each other. So it is the same concept when it comes to building startup teams. Likewise, this is nothing new. The US tech world already is deeply dependent on global talent. We just wait for it to come to us in order to deploy it. You saw all the hands that went up when they asked how many people are from outside the US. 2/3 of technology, mathematics, computer science jobs in Silicon Valley are filled by people who were born outside of the United States. A Georgetown study found that 33 of the 50 AI startups deemed most promising by Forbes have at least one foreign-born co-founder. In other words, 2/3. So there seems to be a pattern with that number. The problem, though, with that is there are 1.5 million unfilled tech jobs in the United States, and that probably, by the way, understates the problem because there are probably a lot of roles that don't even get published because the company knows it's just not going to happen. But only 56,000 approximately H-1B visas are allocated to the tech sector per year. So waiting for the global talent to come to us simply is not a real solution to this problem. Likewise, there are over 1 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs in the United States. And that number should scare us because those are the companies that we entrust with our money, our identity, everything, basically saying we desperately need some more security help. If I checked into my hotel last night and walked past reception, past a sign saying desperately seeking security professionals, then I probably would have been a little worried. But that is the case with pretty much every technology company that we are currently dealing with. So all that this does is bring it to its logical extreme, or its logical conclusion, rather, in terms of how we already source the most important resource in the world for building our companies, which is the talent. I want to leave you with a few case studies as well of some of the startups I saw that were doing this through my fund and through Toptal. In terms of, there were two elements to the question of global teams and North American or European markets. The first was US-born companies sourcing globally. So I don't know if any of you have heard of Snapper. It was a Y Combinator star, and the founder is based here in San Francisco. They're doing wonderfully. They're leading the way on many elements of digital photography. They built their entire product and engineering team in Medellin with my fund's help. And the founder did exactly the right thing, which he didn't view any distinction between the US and non-US team. It was one team, just some of them happened to be in Palo Alto, some of them happened to be in Medellin and elsewhere. Another one is actually the great Andrew Ng, the former director of the Stanford AI Laboratory and the founder of Coursera and the AI Fund, with coordination with my team, built several deep learning AI teams in Medellin, Colombia. And if you look it up, there's a TechCrunch article about it. You can just look up Andrew Ng Medellin, and there's a wonderful article about him scouring the world for AI talent and looking for strategic rising tech hubs and everything. Then there's the other direction. So for the founders who are not from the United States, especially, I want to say to you, the other side of the hypothesis I was testing was, can a company born outside the United States grow as quickly in the North American markets as a company that is originally from here and entirely based here? And the answer was an unequivocal yes, as long as you are building a global product. Obviously, some products are built for local markets to address a specific issue in those markets. But if it is a global product, you're solving a global problem, then absolutely you can. And the barriers to that are far more perceived than real. Two companies I was tremendously inspired by watching. One was KiwiBot, which again is now based heavily here in San Francisco. You might see some of their robots rolling around. They're one of the leaders for last mile robotic delivery. Entirely born in Latin America, and now they have deep market penetration here. They just signed a huge deal with Dubai. They started focusing on their local markets and then realized this is a global problem. Why not sell globally? Because that's probably going to lead to a much faster growth rate. Another one that was tremendously inspiring was Alpha.io, which is leading the way on basically using the blockchain to change the way that we define asset ownership in many respects, which is a global problem. The team is originally from Brazil, and I became good friends with them over many years and worked with them as they expanded from Brazil now to the United States and globally, and became so close with the CEO that she actually flew in for this talk, so she's going to join me on stage briefly at the end to also take questions from the founder point of view. So I have witnessed this with some of the leading startups in the world, that they have done this successfully in both directions. And again, the barriers are more perceived than real. The tools and techniques exist to scale, the best of what we associate with all of us being in the same room together, but on a global scale. And again, I don't think it's optional. I just said why I don't think it's optional for us as founders. I also want to say I don't think it's optional for mankind anymore. I think we are facing so many huge challenges right now, collectively, in terms of, I mean, you name it, climate change, energy, health, and also the terrible problem of inequality around the world and the many things that feed upon that. And the venture capital startup world is uniquely positioned to help lead the charge on addressing those. We, all of you, helped get the world through the pandemic much better than anyone had expected. It chills my blood to think if the pandemic had been 10 years earlier, before some of these tools had been built that allowed us to work and communicate globally. Now we are uniquely positioned to lead the world beyond it and to take the pandemic as the launch point for a new global way of thinking in terms of how we build our teams. I always tell founders, end with the big, like, what's the big why behind what you do? What gets you out of bed in the morning? For me, the big why is I would like to see a world before the day I die where what you look like, where you're from, who your family is, where you're physically located, all the historical things that have affected someone's opportunity fall by the wayside. And every person on earth has the exact same opportunity to apply themselves and to contribute to the absolute best of their abilities. I think we can achieve that in our lifetimes, and I think that the day that we do is the day that many of the other problems that we read about in the news these days are going to have the legs kicked out from beneath them. I don't know if any of you know who Diana Trujillo is. She's a young woman from Cali, Colombia. She came to the United States as a young lady, as a girl really. $300 in her pocket, cleaned houses to put herself through university, and now she leads the robotics team for the NASA Perseverance rover on Mars. And so I always find myself reflecting back on her story because it simultaneously shows the ingenuity that mankind is capable of when we are faced with a true barrier and challenge, in this case, the challenge of space, of crossing the final frontier, but also of the barriers here on Earth that many people still have to go through in order to best contribute to that. So I want to achieve a world where every person like her is able to contribute to the best of their abilities, no matter where on planet Earth they may be. And I think I am here because I need your help in doing that. So thank you so much for coming. And Manuela, would you like to join me for a minute? I wanted you to hear a few words. One of my favorite founders runs a global team with a wonderful company. I wanted you to hear from the founder point of view as well for a few minutes, and then I think together we'll take any questions of yours.
Thank you for having me, Erik. I just found out 5 minutes ago that I was going to come up on stage.
Yeah.
But my company is creating a decentralized solution that will really transform the way we think of asset ownership. So it's only fair that our team is completely decentralized as well. And even before we started to work together, we already had kind of like few bodies in New York, most of the dev team in Brazil. Right now we're 26 people, and I'm based out of LA, and there's only 3 people in LA. We have a dev team in São Paulo. We have a product team, which the head of product is here in Palo Alto. He is also the head of digital for Apple. So very, very neat dude. Yeah. And he runs a team out of Argentina, out of UX and UI. And our sales team is in New York, which means we made it work despite the pandemic. It was how we wanted to start running the business. But with the pandemic, that gave us a unique advantage. We were already remote. We were already on, we don't use Slack. We're Brazilian, so we like WhatsApp more. I have like 50 groups of WhatsApp. Everybody thinks I'm like talking to my friends. I'm like, no. So yeah, and our journey with Erik started, what, 6 years ago?
Probably at this point.
Yeah, 6, 7 years ago. It took him about 3 to write the first check, which
wasn't
very big.
Took you 3 years to get to the point where I could write the first check.
Very glad you did that.
We're
now,
very
huh?
close, you can tell. We're very close.
So yeah, I guess we open up for questions in terms of, unique challenges, scaling up, running a business remotely.
books pre-pandemic and haven't learned a lot post-pandemic about how to continue to do that.
Yeah. You're the CEO.
Have you read Principles?
I have not.
Ray Dalio?
Is that a post-pandemic book?
No, this is like the father of value investing. He has one of the biggest funds in the U.S.
Largest hedge fund in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. And just a unique value investor. And just pick up that book. It's his principles. He wrote them down. There's another Brazilian entrepreneur called Jorge Paulo Lemann. They own Anheuser-Busch, which is InBev now. And anyway, started as a small Brazilian beer company and is one of the richest men in the world. And his book is called Dream Big. Says it costs the same thing to dream big as it does to dream small, which is absolutely true. But that's a question that's been on my mind since like day one. And I've gone through situations of having to fire someone which is super senior, was there from the beginning of the company on, because it was just not fitting the company culture anymore. It's not because that person specifically is bad. It's not because that person is not capable. It's just because that person was not operating at a level and putting forward the posture that you have to grow a startup to a unicorn status. And so I'd say write those principles down. They're going to be very unique to you as a founder. I think every founder's company is their baby. Just be crystal clear about it. We have a house in LA now, which is our headquarters, and I also live in it. And
So it's a tax write-off?
Yeah, just a tax. We made it work.
I want to add to that. I completely agree. What Dalio did amazingly is that, and this is so important when you're doing any business that needs to be contrarian in its thinking, is he truly instilled a culture where everyone is comfortable telling the CEO when they think that his idea is terrible. And there's a famous, if you also read the book Originals by Adam Grant, the Wharton professor, great book. There's literally a part where Dalio was in a meeting, keep in mind, CEO of the world's largest hedge fund. And one of the junior analysts wrote him after the meeting saying, "You deserve a D- for your performance in that meeting, Ray." And I mean, this is this person's boss. And Dalio actually said, "Okay, what does everyone else think about this?" And it was a learning experience and everything. That's what has allowed their fund to be so innovative, is that there is no groupthink and people are expected to challenge every idea. I would also say, as with culture, it's in many ways, it's similar. The similar principles to if you were in person. It's the small things also that build up. So having small virtual meetups and complementing those now that we can with physical meetups. Like I was saying, the pandemic may have made us think that when we say remote global teams that we mean it at a much more extreme level than we actually do. It doesn't mean never meet up in person. It just means do it for the right reasons and when it is truly the right moment. So everything from, I know it's a cliche at this point, but things like Zoom coffees, things like the small interactions that let people speak beyond the bounds of a specific meeting, complementing that with in-person when you see fit, and really just setting the right tone as the leader and being vulnerable, frankly. I would say the greatest leaders that I've ever met, and also the history has showed, are those who are willing to be vulnerable, especially when faced with the big moments that we're all facing collectively now. People really take note of that. I could go on that topic all day, but we'll take a few more questions. Gentleman here.
First of all, bom dia, obrigado.
De nada.
Muito bem.
For first round capital.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about maybe your average bite size, what your investment thesis is. Personally, I'm the founder of a company called Mentor. We're a software platform that enables any kind of online content to deliver instant feedback with AI. And I'm kind of wondering,
Sure. So the bad news, well, not bad news, but one piece of news is the reason I joined Toptal is I did finish deploying first draw capital. That being said, when I
Last investment.
Yeah, you closed me out, so yeah, I'm sure. You got the last laugh, basically.
Still waiting on that last wire.
That being said, I still
Just
do.
kidding.
It was done. So basically, there was so we finished the fund. That being said, I do still sometimes syndicate deals when I see a company that's really great. So it's not that I'm out of the business entirely. But to answer your question, though, let me tell you really quick what I witnessed as most predictive of success for for startups. Number one, the founder is solving a problem that he or she has personally dealt with. I always ask, what problem are you solving? If you can't answer that, there is no second question. That variable alone has pretty much crushed every other variable that I've seen in terms of predicting startup success. So what problem are you solving? What makes you such an expert on it? Basically, what are the consequences of that problem? The next thing is that they have demonstrated initial traction. It's very difficult to raise capital before you have some traction, unfortunately. It's just, the investors just don't have a lot of information to work with until you have a functional MVP and some indication of happy users. That being said, you can hack that. You can basically demonstrate that the market exists. You can have a technology that looks like a cool technology, but it's really a cardboard box with the founder inside acting like a technology, basically. As long as it validates the key hypotheses behind the tech and the market, that is enough to raise your first capital. The three metrics you want to focus on most: growth, retention, engagement. Are they growing? Are you growing week over week, month over month? Investors care much more about trajectory than absolute level. Don't go to 1 million users and then sit there. Get 2 users, then 4, then 8, then 16 over the weeks, and show that curve. That's what gets investors excited. Retention, are they staying with you? Engagement, the depth and frequency of use of the product. So for example, if it was Uber, are they using it once a month, or are they using it every time they have to go somewhere? Depth and frequency. So are they growing? Are they staying? Do they love you? When I retire, I tend to write some songs about the concept, basically. And then finally, is it a technology that is a learning technology? This is where data comes in. So the muscle metaphor I mentioned earlier, is it a product that every time you use it, it's learning and getting better? Because that's what defines a sustainable competitive advantage so that you don't get squeezed out in the end. There are so many other factors, but frankly, in my experience, it really comes down to those. And of course, the team, of course. Frankly, I would say as low as 95%, as high as, of course, 100% of the early investment decision comes down to the team. So just showing who you are, why you're passionate about this, you understand the problem you're solving, that really is what closes the deal. The rest becomes diligence at that stage.
And don't give up. Like, it's what I said. It took him like 5 years to invest in us, but he was basically the most valuable asset that we had on our corner, because Erik had no problem in telling us, the things that we needed to change to make this a backable company, the metrics that we needed to hit. And so find someone that might not necessarily be the right investor for that moment. Like, one of my closest friends is a huge unicorn investor, and I don't want him to invest in us right now, because his advice for me is much more valuable. Having those strategy meetings with him like once a quarter or whatever it is, and knowing that he is completely unbiased because he doesn't have any capital in there, but he also put me in touch with someone that's gonna lead my next round. He's in the ecosystem, he's in your corner, and he's telling you the hard truths, and you don't have to be afraid to be vulnerable because you're not trying to get his money.
Yeah, that actually brings up a great point. I know it stinks, but the best time to start speaking to investors is often a little before you're truly raising, because it does take the temperature of the room down a little. It gets you to start getting feedback, which is what we did for a few years before I was able to invest, in terms of like, this is the kind of thing that will get you to the point where I can invest. So yeah, it's never too early to just start those conversations and start getting some initial read. Before we take the next question, I forgot to say, I'm here both days. So I know we won't get to every question probably. I'll be right across the street at the Toptal, at the Toptal booth. So absolutely come by. And yeah, sir. You want to start?
Yeah, we debated that in São Paulo. Like, my CTO is also a co-founder, and he's in São Paulo, which makes it way easier as well to run a remote team of developers from like South America. And we had an office for like a minute, and it just didn't make any sense. Like, it was an additional source of cost. They don't like going there. They work at night. They all have their own routines. They're on like, whatever, WhatsApp, or, on whatever tool, Slack, 24 hours a day. And for us, it just didn't make sense. I feel like for a sales team, it makes sense, but for a group of developers, I don't know.
Yeah, a lot of great developers, I mean, they have their own rhythms in many respects that they don't want disturbed. And so I've done both. With my fund, we did strategically open some co-working spaces across Latin America. Sometimes it was a security thing as well. If it was a city that, you know, people were just needed a safe place to come talk to each other and everything. That being said, I will say through my work with Toptal, I've seen that, yeah, I don't think you need to own any real estate at all. I think that you are at the point now where when you do want to have those key in-person meetings and events, there are many services and offerings available to you to do that. But I would say that you don't need that as a fixed part of your cost structure at all. And I think that if you approach that as its own animal, you can replicate all of the positive things we associate in our minds of being in the same room together in the digital sphere as well.